This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. Lila Harris, a 15-year-old girl with a weight on her shoulders far beyond her years, had grown accustomed to silence. It was a silence that filled the walls of her home, a heavy, oppressive silence that clung to the air like a damp fog. The kind of silence that spoke volumes without ever uttering a single word. Her family had become fractured over the years, once whole and vibrant, but now a collection of isolated individuals who seemed to share nothing but the same address. Her mother, once a woman full of warmth and life, had become a shadow of the person she had once been. Lila could still remember the days when her mother's laughter filled the house, when she would dance around the kitchen while cooking dinner, singing to the radio in a way that made everything feel lighter. But that version of her mother had long since disappeared. In her place was a woman who spent most of her days lost in thought, eyes dull and distant, as though the world outside had lost its color. The things that had once brought her joy, work, socializing, even spending time with Lila, had all but vanished. There were days when her mother didn't even leave her bedroom, and Lila found herself tiptoeing around the house, unsure of how to navigate the quiet space they once shared. The cause of this change was never openly discussed. Lila knew that her mother's depression had worsened after her father left, but the details were always a blur of whispered conversations and cryptic comments. It was as if the decision had been made to leave the truth unspoken, an unacknowledged wound that festered silently. Her father, an enigmatic figure in her life, had never been a constant presence. He was a man of few words, always absent, always busy with his work, his business trips, his responsibilities that seemed to outweigh the needs of his family. But the divorce had created a rift between him and Lila too, one that seemed irreparable. Lila hadn't heard from him in months, and the few interactions they had shared since he left were brief and devoid of any real connection. At school, Lila did not fare much better. The halls were filled with laughter, with friendships, with people who seemed to know exactly where they fit in the world, while Lila drifted like a ghost, untouched by the current of teenage life. She had friends, if they could even be called that, acquaintances she saw between classes, people who smiled at her when they passed but never lingered. She had never been the type to seek out attention or popularity, but her loneliness was not something she wore proudly. It was a quiet, gnawing ache that she carried with her everywhere. She often found herself wishing that someone would notice, that someone would see past the wall she had built around herself. But those wishes remained unanswered. The other students seemed to have everything she lacked. They had families that came to their soccer games, parents who threw them birthday parties, friends who shared inside jokes and spent weekends together. Lila had none of that. Instead, her weekends were spent alone, locked in her room or wandering the empty streets of their suburban neighborhood, trying to fill the void that seemed to widen with every passing day. The emptiness of her home reflected itself in the emptiness of her heart. The arrival of Chloe, her half-sister, only deepened the divide. Chloe was born just a year ago, but Lila felt like she had been there forever. The birth of the baby should have been a joyous occasion, something that could bring the family closer, something to unite them in shared love and care. But for Lila, it was the final straw in a long line of disappointments. Her mother's attention, which had already been sparse, now became entirely consumed by the infant. Lila, who had once been the sole focus of her mother's love and affection, was now an afterthought. The cries of the baby replaced the silence, but it wasn't the kind of noise that brought life back to the house. It was a reminder of just how little attention Lila was receiving. The baby was helpless, and her mother was consumed with the task of taking care of her, leaving Lila to fend for herself in the periphery of their home. The baby's presence became an ever-present reminder of everything that had changed and everything that Lila had lost. Every night, as Chloe cried out for attention, Lila would retreat to her room, feeling the bitterness rise within her. She couldn't understand why her mother was so focused on a newborn. The baby, who didn't know any better, was stealing the love that had once been all hers. And what about Lila? What about the daughter who had spent her life trying to keep everything together when her parents had fallen apart? What about the teenager who had no one to talk to? no one who truly understood her pain. At night, Lila would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning in a frenzy of emotion. She wanted to scream, to throw something, to make it all stop. She wanted to make her mother see her, to notice that she was still there, still in need of love and attention. But every time she tried, her mother's response was the same: a distant smile, a brief touch on the arm, and then back to Chloe. The baby would always come first. Lila began to wonder if anyone cared at all. She felt invisible, like she was fading into the background, a mere shadow in a house that was supposed to be home. The loneliness grew with each passing day, and the sense of abandonment began to fester, becoming something darker, something that she couldn't shake. She wanted out of the house, out of the pain, out of the emptiness, but there was nowhere to go. She was trapped in a life she had not chosen, a life that no longer made sense. In the silence that enveloped her every day, Lila's anger began to simmer, hidden beneath a calm exterior. She didn't know what to do with it, didn't know how to release it, but it was there, like a storm waiting to break. And when the storm did come, when the pressure became too much, there would be no way to stop it. No one would see it coming. No one would know what had been building in the quiet of that broken home. Lila didn't know it yet, but the walls of her fractured world were closing in on her, and the course of her life was about to change forever. The birth of Chloe should have been a moment of joy. It should have been a fresh beginning, a chance for Lila's family to heal, to reconnect, and perhaps even mend some of the cracks that had formed over the years. But for Lila, the arrival of the baby felt more like an intrusion of permanent change that could never be undone. It marked the final shift in the delicate balance of her life, one that she had worked so hard to maintain, even if no one had noticed. Lila had always been a quiet observer, more accustomed to the shadows than the spotlight. She knew how to stay out of the way, how to be unnoticed. That skill had been her survival mechanism ever since her father left. But now, with Chloe in the picture, it felt as if there was no longer any space for her at all. Everything was changing, and not for the better. The house, which had already been thick with an oppressive silence, became even more stifling. The sounds of crying, cooing, and the constant bustle of baby care replaced the few fragments of peace Lila had managed to hold on to. At first, she told herself that it was just an adjustment period. She tried to tell herself that the chaos was temporary, that soon things would return to some semblance of normalcy. But the more time passed, the more Lila realized that the chaos was not just temporary, it was permanent. Every day, her mother grew more absorbed in the needs of the baby, less present in the world outside of Chloe's cries and demands. Lila began to wonder if her mother even remembered what it was like to have only one child, a daughter who at one point had been the center of attention. Lila had spent the last few years trying to fill the void left by her father's departure. She had gotten used to having to fend for herself. She had learned to keep her emotions locked away, to play the part of the quiet, obedient daughter who never complained. It was easier that way. But now, as her mother poured all her energy into Chloe, Lila couldn't help but feel invisible. She became just another part of the background, a mere spectator in her own life. Her mother would spend entire days in the nursery, tending to Chloe's every need. The house smelled of baby lotion, diapers, and the distinct, sterile scent of baby food. Every corner of their home had been overtaken by this new life, this tiny, helpless creature who seemed to require everything from everyone. And in this new world, there was no room for Lila. It was as though she had been erased, replaced by something more demanding, more consuming. Lila couldn't help but resent Chloe for that. It wasn't the baby's fault, but Lila couldn't stop the bitterness that gnawed at her. She had been used to being the only child, to being the one who mattered, the one who came first. But now, every time her mother held the baby in her arms, every time Chloe's soft giggles filled the air, Lila felt more and more irrelevant. There was no space for her in this new family dynamic, and no one seemed to notice the way she slowly began to disappear. Even at school, Lila's isolation deepened. Her peers, who once had shared at least some semblance of her quiet loneliness, were now caught up in their own lives. Their friendships were blossoming, their social circles growing with every passing day, while Lila stayed in the shadows, drifting through each class like a ghost. She wanted to be part of that world, wanted to feel connected to something, anything. But it was as if the more Chloe grew, the more Lila shrank, retreating further into herself. At home, Lila began to keep to herself more than ever. She stopped coming out for dinner, eating in her room while her mother sat at the table, playing the role of the concerned mother. Lila didn't need her concern. She needed her mother to see her, to acknowledge her, to remember that she had once been the center of attention, the focus of the household. But every day, Chloe's needs seemed to eclipse her own. The jealousy that simmered in Lila's chest began to feel like a living thing, something that followed her through every room, every space, every quiet moment. It whispered to her, telling her that this was not fair, that she had been forgotten. She tried to be patient. She tried to tell herself that it wasn't Chloe's fault, that the baby was just a newborn who needed constant care, but the resentment grew slowly, silently. It wasn't just that Chloe needed attention. It was that Chloe took all the attention, leaving Lila with nothing. Her mother didn't have time for her anymore. There was no more laughter in their house, no more moments where her mother would listen to her, would ask about her day, would even seem to care. The rift between them deepened, even if neither of them spoke about it. Lila found herself yearning for something she hadn't even known. She needed a real conversation, a genuine connection with the one person who should have been there for her. But instead, she was left alone with her thoughts and growing resentment. Lila started skipping school more often, telling her mother that she was too tired or that she wasn't feeling well. She wanted to be anywhere but at home, where the constant reminder of Chloe's presence was inescapable. It was easier to sit alone in her room and let her thoughts consume her. She stopped trying to be the perfect daughter, stopped pretending that everything was fine. She let the silence between her and her mother stretch until it became an unspoken barrier, a wall that neither of them knew how to break down. The arrival of Chloe, once a hopeful symbol of new life, became something else entirely to Lila. It was a reminder of everything she had lost: the attention, the connection, the love that had once been hers alone. It became the spark that ignited something in Lila, a flame of anger and resentment that burned steadily beneath the surface. The baby had taken everything from her, and as much as she tried to bury those feelings, they couldn't be erased. They lingered, growing darker with each passing day. It was the arrival of Chloe that changed the trajectory of Lila's life, that set in motion a chain of events she would never be able to undo. It was the catalyst that started the slow unraveling of the threads that held her together. In her quiet, hidden pain, Lila began to change, and the girl who once quietly observed the world around her would soon find herself at the center of a tragedy she never thought possible. The weeks that followed Chloe's arrival were marked by a slow, creeping erosion in the fabric of Lila's life. It wasn't something that happened all at once. It wasn't a singular event, but rather 1,000 tiny cuts to the parts of her that had once felt whole. Each day seemed to chip away at her resolve, until she was left with little more than the barest semblance of the person she had once been. At first, she tried to fight it. She made an effort to stay out of the way, to stay quiet. But no matter how much she tried to slip into the background, no matter how much she tried to minimize her presence, she was always there, always on the periphery, always watching, always alone. It wasn't that anyone directly ignored her. It was that they didn't seem to notice her absence. Her mother, preoccupied with Chloe's needs, never seemed to notice when Lila quietly withdrew. The house, once a place where Lila had felt some semblance of belonging, had become nothing more than a shadow of what it had once been. Lila's mother was no longer the woman she had known. The woman who had been her mother, her protector, her guide, had been replaced by a person who was consumed by the demands of a new life. She could no longer see her daughter, could no longer be the mother Lila had once depended on. The once vibrant, loving woman who had cared for Lila with patience and warmth had been swept away by the constant demands of Chloe. Every room in their house now reeked of baby powder, the sharp smell of formula, and the faint sound of baby monitors humming in the background. Every waking hour was consumed by the baby, and with it, every ounce of attention Lila had once commanded had dissipated like smoke in the air. The more time Lila spent alone, the more she felt like a stranger in her own home. It wasn't just that her mother was absent, it was that she was someone else. The emotional distance between them stretched further each day, becoming an abyss that neither of them knew how to cross. Lila stopped trying to fill the space. She stopped trying to make herself seen. After all, what was the point? It became easier, almost comforting, to slip into the shadows and let the world forget she existed. Her interactions with others at school became strained. Where once there had been a quiet camaraderie with a few friends, now there was nothing. Her classmates, oblivious to her growing isolation, went about their lives with their laughter and chatter, while Lila stood on the outside, watching, waiting for something that never came. She didn't belong with them anymore either. The bond they had shared had loosened with time, and now she was just another face in the crowd, unnoticed, ignored. She found herself withdrawing into herself further, existing in a world where no one looked her way unless they needed something from her. She didn't even recognize herself anymore. The girl who had once prided herself on being strong, independent, and silent in her suffering had become a hollow shell, desperate for a spark of connection that never arrived. She saw it in the mirror, this distant version of herself staring back. Like a stranger, she no longer knew. The once clear lines of her face had become sharper, more angular, as if the pressure of everything she had buried inside was beginning to reshape her. Her eyes, once full of curiosity, were now clouded with something darker, something she didn't know how to name. Was it sadness, or was it anger? Both, maybe. At home, the feeling of being forgotten became overwhelming. Every time she tried to talk to her mother, every time she attempted to bring up something that had bothered her, she was met with a distracted, half-hearted response. Her mother would nod absently, eyes flickering toward the baby, her voice trailing off as she turned her attention back to Chloe. There was nothing left for Lila to latch onto, nothing left to hold her in place. The more she tried to force herself into the equation, the more her efforts were met with resistance, and the deeper she sank into the void. Her room, once a sanctuary, had become just another place where the weight of her loneliness bore down on her. She had stopped caring about the little things she used to enjoy reading, drawing, writing. Now, all she could do was sit in her room, staring at the walls or listening to the muffled sounds of her mother tending to Chloe. She would lie awake at night, the hum of the baby monitor the only sound that filled the silence, a constant reminder of how irrelevant she had become. She wondered if her mother ever thought of her anymore, or if she was just another piece of furniture in the house, something that blended into the background until it was no longer noticed. Lila began to lose track of time. Days bled into one another. There was no distinction between them, just endless hours of waiting, of silently existing in a place where nothing mattered. The things that used to make her feel alive, school, friendships, the occasional joy of spending time with her mother, were now just distant memories. She had become a ghost in her own life. She moved through her days with a numbness that was almost comforting, her mind too tired to care anymore. The thought of fighting back, of standing up for herself, had become so foreign that she didn't even know where to start. What was the point? Nothing mattered. The only thing that kept her grounded, kept her tethered to the world, was the growing knot of resentment she couldn't shake off. It simmered beneath the surface, a quiet force that had taken root and was growing stronger each day. It was a constant undercurrent, a whisper that told her that she had been wronged, that she had been forgotten in favor of a baby who would never even know the sacrifices she had made. And that whisper began to turn into something louder, something sharper, something that gnawed at her every waking moment. She tried to push the feeling aside, to ignore it, but it wasn't possible. As the days passed, the knot tightened, the anger growing into something dark and dangerous. It wasn't just about being ignored anymore, was about being erased. Lila had become invisible, a mere afterthought in a world that had been reshaped by Chloe. But what if she didn't have to be invisible? What if there was a way to make her presence known? To show the world that she had once existed, that she mattered. What if she could finally make her mark, even if it meant going to extremes? In the quiet, unseen spaces of her life, Lila began to consider that possibility. She began to wonder if the only way to regain control, to regain herself, was to take drastic action. The idea, as dangerous and irrational as it was, began to take root in her mind. It didn't seem so far-fetched anymore. And for the first time in a long time, Lila felt something like power stirring inside her. The tension was building. The pieces were slowly falling into place. The moment of weakness arrived without warning, like a gust of wind that snapped the branches of a once sturdy tree. It wasn't something that had been planned or prepared for, but rather something that had accumulated over time, the product of months of neglect and isolation. Lila had always been a quiet observer, hiding her pain behind the walls she had so carefully constructed. But the walls had begun to crack, the pressure of years of silent suffering finally taking its toll. It wasn't the first time she had felt this way, this consuming, suffocating feeling of being trapped. She had known it since Chloe's arrival, when the world around her shifted and rearranged itself in a way she couldn't understand. It had been a slow, insidious process, one that crept up on her in small increments until she was left drowning in the weight of it. But that night, the night it all came crashing down, was different. It was a moment when the dam finally broke, and Lila's carefully constructed facade shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. She had been lying in her bed, staring at the ceiling in the darkness, the sounds of her mother rocking Chloe in the next room drifting through the walls. The baby's cries, sharp and unrelenting, filled the space, and for the first time, Lila didn't try to block them out. The sounds were a constant reminder of her failure, of her inability to compete for attention, of her diminishing relevance in a home that had once been hers. She had spent months trying to ignore it, trying to bury the resentment that simmered beneath the surface, but tonight, it all felt unbearable. The feeling of being invisible had reached a peak. Lila could almost hear the walls closing in around her, the air growing thinner with each passing second. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the thoughts swirling in her mind, but they wouldn't go away. There was no escaping them now. The quiet desperation that had been creeping up on her for weeks suddenly felt deafening, as though the silence around her was a vacuum, sucking her in, pulling her under. She had never felt so alone, so utterly forgotten. It was as though she had never existed at all. The isolation, the distance between her and her mother, had become a physical weight on her chest. She could feel the pressure building, the sense of abandonment so heavy that it was almost suffocating. Her mother's devotion to Chloe, her complete and total focus on the baby, felt like a betrayal. How could she have let this happen? How could she have let herself become so irrelevant in the eyes of the one person who was supposed to care for her? Lila had been the one who needed her, the one who had been there before Chloe arrived, the one who had always been there, and yet, now she was invisible. What did she mean to her mother anymore? Was she even seen? The resentment that had been building for months finally spilled over, a torrent of anger that she couldn't control. It was a moment of weakness, of complete surrender to the flood of emotions that had been festering in her for so long. It wasn't just the baby, no. It wasn't just that. It was the deep, all-encompassing sense that she had been discarded. Chloe hadn't just taken her place in the household. In her mother's heart, she had erased her. The love, the attention, the connection that she had once shared with her mother was now a distant memory. And for what? For a child who didn't even know her name, who couldn't even look at her and understand what she had lost. Lila's mind raced. Her thoughts collided in a chaotic whirlwind of anger, jealousy, and hopelessness. She hated the baby. She hated her mother. She hated the way her world had been twisted beyond recognition. And most of all, she hated herself for not being strong enough to fix it. All of the self-loathing that had been festering within her for months erupted in a violent burst, the floodgates opening to let all of her fury and frustration spill out into the darkness. She didn't know what she was thinking as she climbed out of bed, her heart pounding in her chest, her body trembling with a mix of fear and adrenaline. She moved quietly through the house, her footsteps soft against the worn floorboards. She wasn't sure what she was doing, only that something inside snapped. She felt untethered, like she was floating in a void, disconnected from everything that once made sense. The baby's cries grew louder as she approached the nursery, a constant reminder of the source of all her pain. The sound felt like it was vibrating through her bones, reverberating in her chest until it felt unbearable. She didn't want to hear it anymore. She didn't want to feel it anymore. The pressure of it all, her mother's neglect, the baby's constant neediness was too much. It wasn't just about being ignored. It was about the deep, gnawing feeling that she no longer mattered in her own home, that no one cared enough to notice. Her hand was shaking as she reached for the door to the nursery. She couldn't stop herself now. She didn't know what she was going to do, only that she needed it to stop. The voice inside her head told her that this was the only way to make everything stop, to make it all go away. The baby's cries, the hurt, the anger, if she could just silence it, if she could just make it stop, then everything would be okay, or at least it would stop being so unbearable. As she pushed the door open, the sight of her mother rocking Chloe gently in her arms seemed like a dream, a distant memory. It felt as if she were watching it all from far away, as though she were no longer present in her own body. There was a coldness in her, a numbness that made everything seem distant, even the anger that had driven her here. In that moment, Lila wasn't sure what she was going to do, only that she had reached the point where she no longer had any control. And that was when everything shattered. The aftermath of the crime was like a slow, painful unraveling, a cascade of events that tore apart the fragile structure of Lila's existence. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was no silence in the house. There were no whispers of life in the background, no hum of daily routine to mask the tension. Now, everything was out in the open, raw and exposed, like a wound that could not be ignored. When the authorities arrived, it was as if time itself had stopped. The air was thick with the scent of something unnatural, something final. Lila, standing in the center of the chaos, couldn't comprehend what had just happened. It was as if she were watching someone else's life unfold before her, a story she wasn't part of, a nightmare that didn't belong to her. She didn't feel guilt. She didn't feel remorse. All she could feel was the sudden weight of the situation, the crushing realization that the world she had known was gone forever. There was no going back, no undoing the terrible thing she had done. It had happened, and now everything had changed. Her mother, who had been the center of her existence, the one person Lila had always relied on, was now gone. She was nothing more than a memory, a specter in Lila's mind, fading more with every passing second. The baby, too, was gone. There was no more crying, no more cooing or gurgling from the nursery. The house, once filled with the sounds of life, was eerily quiet, its empty rooms a stark reminder of what had been taken from them. The police were thorough, their movements mechanical as they processed the scene. Lila was numb, unable to respond to their questions, unable to explain herself. She didn't know how to explain. The words, even if she could find them, seemed useless. Nothing could justify what she had done. Nothing could repair the rift that had been torn between her and the world. And yet, in the midst of the chaos, there was a strange calm within her, an unsettling sense of detachment from the reality of the situation. It was as if she were watching the events unfold from a distance, as if she weren't the one responsible for this unthinkable tragedy. When the police officers took her into custody, she didn't resist. There was no fight left in her. She wasn't sure what would come next, but she knew it didn't matter. What could they do to her that she hadn't already done to herself? What punishment could they give her that was worse than what she already felt the crushing weight of knowing that she had lost everything. The house she once called home, the mother she had once depended on, the future that had once seemed bridal of it, was gone in an instant. The media coverage that followed was relentless, a constant barrage of news reports and sensationalized headlines that painted her as a monster, a child-turned-killer. Her face, once innocent and full of potential, was now a symbol of violence, a grotesque caricature of everything that had gone wrong in the world. The world couldn't understand it. They couldn't understand how someone so young could commit such an unspeakable act. And Lila didn't have the words to explain it to them. There were no words that could make sense of it. How could anyone ever understand the depths of her pain, the suffocating isolation she had felt? How could they understand the desperate rage that had taken hold of her when everything she knew had been taken away? Her trial, when it finally came, was a spectacle. Lawyers and experts spoke in sterile, clinical tones, trying to piece together the fragmented story of a girl whose life had spiraled out of control. They talked about her upbringing, about the neglect she had endured, about the emotional toll of her mother's obsession with Chloe. But none of it seemed to matter in the end. The public had already made up its mind. Lila was a villain, a threat, someone who needed to be locked away for the rest of her life. They couldn't see her as anything else. To them, she was the girl who killed an innocent child who could never defend themselves, a child who had done nothing to deserve such a fate. The sentencing was swift. It was almost as if the world had been waiting for something like this to happen, eager to move on from the tragedy, eager to find someone to blame. Lila was convicted and sent to a juvenile detention center, a cold and impersonal place where she would remain until her sentence was reviewed, until the system decided what to do with her. Inside the facility, Lila's life became a blur of sterile rooms, bland meals, and the constant hum of other lost souls. The world outside continued to spin, oblivious to her, while she remained a prisoner of her own choices, her own despair. She had expected the isolation, the judgment, but what she hadn't expected was the complete and utter emptiness that filled every corner of her new existence. In the days that followed, she would come to understand the true cost of her actions, the irreparable damage done to everyone who had once been a part of her world. Her mother, her home, her future, all of it, had been obliterated by a single, fateful moment. She had become a stranger to the girl who had once had dreams, once had a future. Now, she was a shadow of that girl, a fragment of someone she would never be again. Outside, the world continued to react to the tragedy. News outlets continued to cover the case, dissecting every detail, trying to find a reason behind the senseless violence. People talked about the pressures of family, the struggles of growing up, the dangers of neglect. But in the end, there were no answers, only questions, no explanations, only speculation. Everyone wanted to understand, to make sense of it, but there was no making sense of something so horrific. There was no way to justify it. Lila's life, once full of promise and potential, had become an example of what happens when pain is ignored, when people are left to fall through the cracks. And as for Lila, she would never be the same. The girl who had once dreamed of a future full of possibility, who had once been full of potential, was gone. In her place was someone who had taken everything she once had and thrown it away in a moment of desperate rage. The consequences of that moment would ripple through the rest of her life, forever altering the course of her existence. And though she could never undo what she had done, she would have to live with it, with the knowledge that she had destroyed everything that had ever mattered to her. In the sterile quiet of the juvenile detention center, Lila sat in the corner of her small cell, the harsh white light casting long shadows on the walls. Time seemed to stretch endlessly here, each moment weighed down by the unbearable silence. The dull hum of the fluorescent lights above was the only constant, like a constant reminder that the world outside had moved on, indifferent to the girl who had once walked through it with dreams, with hopes. The girl who had disappeared forever the night her rage had taken control. Lila had long since stopped trying to understand what had happened. The why of it, the how it, no longer mattered. What had once seemed like an all-consuming question now felt irrelevant, as though she had passed through a door into a space where the past had no hold over her. The reflection she saw in the mirror each day was no longer the girl she had once been. There was no connection between the girl who had dreamed of being free, of finding peace, and the hollow figure that stared back at her. The face was still hers, but it felt foreign, as though she were looking at a stranger who had done something unforgivable. The process of reflection, the slow disintegration of the self, had begun even before the trial. The moment she had been apprehended, the weight of her actions had started to sink in. It wasn't an immediate recognition. The reality of what she had done hadn't fully hit her yet. It had felt like an out-of-body experience, a separation between the girl who had committed the crime and the one who was now left to face the consequences. But now, in the stillness of the detention center, the full gravity of her actions pressed down on her like a weight she could not escape. Each day, she found herself retracing the steps that had led her to that moment, the moment when she had let her anger consume her and turn her into something unrecognizable. It was not just the act of killing, of taking another life, that haunted her. It was the realization of how deeply she had been affected by the isolation, the jealousy, the desperation. How had it all spiraled so quickly, so irrevocably? How had she allowed herself to become a weapon of destruction, capable of something so horrific? The questions gnawed at her, unanswered and relentless. But the answers weren't what haunted her most. What lingered in her mind, what twisted inside her like a never-ending knot, was the knowledge that she had destroyed everything. Her mother, the one person she had hoped would see her, had been taken from her in an instant. Chloe, the baby who had once been a symbol of all that was lost, was now a memory of something that could never be reclaimed. And Lila herself, the girl who had once been capable of love, capable of hope, had turned into a shadow, a ghost of someone who had burned her own life to the ground. There was no coming back from that. No redemption, no second chances. Lila's reflection had changed, yes, but so had her entire perception of who she was and what she had become. In the months that followed the crime, the world had viewed her as a villain, a monster, someone who could be easily placed in a box and labeled, to be studied, to be dissected. But in the stillness of her cell, she began to see herself differently. Not as a product of her circumstances or her upbringing, but as someone who had, for a brief moment, stepped outside of everything she had ever known. She wasn't the angry girl from the broken home anymore. She wasn't the neglected daughter who had been abandoned by her mother. She was the one who had taken a life, and that was a burden she would carry forever. The isolation of the detention center made the silence even more deafening. It was a space where she had no distractions, no excuses. In the outside world, there had always been noise people, places, the constant movement of life. But here, it was just her, alone with the consequences of her actions, alone with the crushing weight of the past. Every day, every hour, she was reminded of what she had done, reminded of how much she had destroyed. She had taken more than just a life that night. She had taken her own future, her own chance at something different, something better. She had lost it all, and there was no getting it back. Her mind often returned to the moments before everything had shattered. The quiet house, the baby's cries, the overwhelming feeling of being ignored, of being forgotten. She could still feel the suffocating weight of it, like a vice around her chest. The pressure had been unbearable. It was as though the world had shifted beneath her feet, and she had no control over the direction it was taking. The arrival of Chloe had upended everything, and in the moment that she had acted, she had felt powerless. But the power she had taken in that moment had not been the power of control, it had been the power of destruction. It had been the power to erase everything, to make the pain stop, to make herself visible again, even if it was in the most terrible way imaginable. But now, as the days stretched into weeks, and the weeks into months, Lila began to realize that there was no escape from the truth. She had done something unforgivable, something that could never be undone. The feeling of self-loathing that had consumed her in the days following the crime had only intensified over time. There were no apologies that could be made, no explanations that could be given. What was done, and there was nothing left but the wreckage of her former life. In the quiet of her cell, Lila faced herself in the mirror once again. She stared into her own eyes, searching for some semblance of the person she had once been, but all she found was a broken reflection, a shadow of the girl who had dreamed of a different life. She was lost, and she knew it. The girl who had once imagined a future filled with possibilities, with hope, was gone. And in her place stood a Strangira girl who had lost everything, who had lost herself, a girl who would never be the same again. It was in these moments, in the silence and solitude, that Lila came to understand the full extent of her actions. The life she had once known, the life she had taken for granted, was now forever beyond her reach. There was no going back, no undoing the damage she had caused. All that remained was the reflection of someone who had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed.